Episode 5, The Language Game.
You're listening to Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we explore ideas and techniques that help you break down partisan barriers, build rapport across the aisle, and make a more persuasive case for the Second Amendment. I'm John Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Cade. In this episode, we're going to talk about what's going right in the gun world. My soft skills segment is about 2 simple behaviors to give you an instant persuasiveness boost. And John's bad argument of the day is about the language game. John, how's your week going?
Pretty good. Gearing up for the holidays, doing all the usual end of the year stuff.
Yeah, I always feel like I'm not quite ready for it every year, and every year it just keeps happening sooner.
Yeah, no one's ready for it.
No. We wasn't ready.
We shortchange ourselves by making Thanksgiving this close to Christmas.
Right. Well, I think in general, on the pro-gun side of the aisle, we kind of focus a lot on what's going wrong. And maybe it's just a universal human condition to focus on the negative, but it gives us a distorted picture of the world. Yeah,
I mean, there's a tendency to catastrophize, especially when you've got anxiety. You know, we've got like a certain amount of vigilance about what laws are getting passed and, you know, what's occurring. I think a lot of our friends in the pro-choice world experience the same thing, where there's the hypervigilance that contributes to a capacity to view things in their worst light and as the most disastrous as possible.
Yeah, I definitely see that in the gun world too. Yeah, and I think a part of it too is how we are becoming used to consuming media as well. And, you know, it's kind of a byproduct of the whole like outrage culture, and if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, and echo chambers on top of it. So like everything we have access to is largely sensationalized and catered to infiltrate our echo chambers where everyone proceeds to sensationalize it further.
Right. I kind of think watching the news is bad for your mental health.
Oh, it definitely is. And I think the media has painted itself into a bit of a corner where it has increased our expectations for sensationalism and now needs to maintain that level of hyperactivity. So they do this thing where they don't take a tall enough view of anything. They never let anything wait to develop. The 24-hour news cycle looks at everything that occurs in the moment that it occurs. So there's the sensation of sitting too close to the screen. So you can see every pixel, and you can see every pixel changing colors really rapidly, but you don't have a concept of what the entire picture is.
Right.
And the news, instead of taking a detached, elevated view of what's going on in the world, has pressed all of our faces up against the screen. So it's this constant, blur of a distorted picture of what's going on because it's being examined too closely and too frantically.
Yeah, especially when you add in that echo chamber effect you mentioned earlier. We just get trapped in this cycle of hearing nothing but bad news. And so one of the things we're trying to do is highlight a few more of the positive stories, like the success stories, and here's a time when things went well for us. And it's not really for any purpose other than to try to provide a little more context to some of the doom and gloom stuff that we typically get, just for our mental health, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need a narrative of success rather than a narrative of persecution.
Right.
Which actually leads to success. If you have a persecution narrative, then everything is framed in terms of what's persecuting me today. If we have a narrative of success, our behaviors and our activities are going to trend more towards success over time.
Yeah, that's a really good way to frame it.
I hear you've got a pretty good success story, Sarah.
As a matter of fact, I do.
Let's hear it.
So my story on this started back in, the events I will describe are in 2015. But it started a little earlier than that when I started getting involved in politics. Back in 2015, back in the year of our Lord, 2015.
Which is ancient history now.
I tied an onion to my belt, as was the style at the time. But yeah, anyways, back in 2015, firearm suppressors were illegal in Minnesota, and they had been, I don't know for how long, just since the NFA.
For context, we're in Minnesota.
Oh, yeah. Actually, that's a point. I don't think we mentioned that yet. Yeah, we're from Minnesota. Anyways, so back in 2015, the Minnesota State Legislature voted on a bunch of pro-gun bills, and one of them was legalizing firearm suppressors. At the time, Minnesota had a pretty mixed legislature. We had a Democrat-controlled Senate, we had a Republican-controlled House, and we had a Democrat governor. And for me personally, I live in the city and my district is like really solidly liberal. And for the most part, I like it that way, but we do disagree on certain issues like guns. For years, I tried to build relationships with my state legislators. And we don't agree on everything, but keeping a good relationship going makes it a little easier, even on issues where we disagree. And it allows me to kind of have a little bit of influence, like around the edges, which is a lot better than nothing. When suppressors came up for a vote, I wrote my representative a letter making a case for legalizing suppressors, and I offered to be like a resource for him if he had any questions on like the technicalities or anything about the legislation. And he actually ended up calling me the next day with some questions. And we chatted on the phone for about half an hour just talking about how suppressors work. Have they ever been used in crimes? And what kind of statistics are there? And what are other states doing? And all I really did was invest a little time in being pleasant to someone who disagreed with me. And the result, maybe if you don't mind, John, I'll just ask you to read that letter that I got from him after the vote.
Dear Sarah, thank you for taking the time to contact me with all of your input on suppressors. I was not a big supporter of this, but with input from you and others, I could see that I did not understand how suppressors worked. I did support this bill when it came to the floor. I very much appreciate your input and encourage you to stay in touch.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And in the end, the bill to legalize suppressors was passed. And we're going to disagree on gun stuff in the future. And I know he didn't change his vote solely because of me. And I know he's not going to vote the way I want every time on gun stuff. However, a small investment of time and energy sometimes seems to pay off when you least expect it.
We will be discussing how to talk to politicians in future episodes. In general, votes are based on political expediency more than anything else.
Yeah, and it might be a while till we get to this topic because we've got a lot of other stuff to cover first. But later on, we're going to talk a little bit about framing your objectives as a win for the politician. In soft skills, we'll talk about specific, actionable techniques to help you become a more persuasive communicator.
What would you say you do here?
Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people. Can't you understand that? What the hell is wrong with you people?
Since we've been focusing so much on difficult intellectual and emotional work lately, this week we're going to take a little break, and we're going to try 2 really simple, really easy techniques for more effective conversations. Now, we've said all along that our goal with this podcast is to get people to want to talk to you about guns. It's not enough to just hurl facts at people. That doesn't work. Defensive bias kicks in, and people reject any facts that are threatening to their worldview.
And thanks to the backfire effect, throwing facts at someone actually makes them even more certain of their original position.
It's science.
If we want to protect the Second Amendment, we need to fight these battles smarter, not harder. And that means practicing skills that make us more persuasive. You want people to value your opinion, to see you as a human being rather than a walking stereotype, and to come to you for high-quality information. That's how you create lasting cultural change.
Challenges to worldview instigate fight or flight response in pretty much everyone. People won't listen to us if we make them feel wrong or stupid. They actually can't listen to us because all of their system resources are being used just to counter our attack on them and their notion of self.
Rather than create problems, we can sidestep them by working with the human operating system rather than against it.
So if defensive bias prevents people from learning, what can we do to help them be open to new information?
Turns out we can actually avoid all kinds of defensive bias just by simply being the type of person who makes others feel respected and valued. One of the best ways to do that is to employ a system I call tactical listening. Tactical listening is when you focus on using specific soft skills in the moment while maintaining awareness of your long-term goal of advancing the pro-Second Amendment cause.
Every time I'm faced with a decision, I close my eyes and see the same picture. Whenever I consider an action, I ask myself, Will this action help to make this picture a reality? Pull it out of my mind and into the world. And I only act if the answer is yes.
Tactical listening encompasses a variety of skills, but the two core behaviors we're covering today are easy and they take about 1 minute a day to practice. While we'll be using these techniques to advance the Second Amendment movement, they're not actually specific to gun conversations. These are things you can practice every day. When you eventually get around to a gun conversation, you'll be well armed and well prepared.
In the meantime, pay attention to the effects these techniques have on your daily conversations. You might notice them working right away.
Now, the first one is my absolute secret weapon. I use this one all the time, and I find that I owe a great deal of my personal, professional, and political success to a technique that takes approximately 1 minute a day to master. That technique is the presence boost. The way this works is it's a trick for keeping your attention focused on the person speaking. That's the key to presence, which makes your conversational partner feel listened to and valued. You're giving them the gift of your attention, and it tells them what they say is important and meaningful to you.
It's really obvious that most people are just waiting for their turn to talk. So when you find someone who is genuinely present when they're listening, it makes a big impression.
Yep, this is the absolute most bang for your buck in listening strategies. So here's how to get started. Set your timer for 1 minute. Decide on a focal point. So what you do for that is you'll pick an area in your body and turn your awareness to that one point. For me, I like to use my nostrils, where I can feel the breath flowing in and out, but you can use anything. You could focus on your toes or the sensation in your fingertips. Gently focus your awareness and attention on that point. Your mind is going to wander, and that's normal. Each time it happens, just gently refocus on the sensation of breath in your nostrils. Don't get mad at yourself when your attention wanders. Just be persistent about bringing it back every single time. With practice, it becomes easier and easier to quiet your mind and simply sit with a soft awareness of your breath. After your minute is up, take note of how you feel. If you spend a lot of time on the internet, like me, your brain is probably profoundly overstimulated most of the time.
It's difficult to sit in silence with soft awareness without thinking of your grocery list or what you should have said in that Facebook argument or about some bill you have to pay or what chore needs to get done.
And over time, as you get better at quiet awareness, you might start to notice a sense of relief from simply allowing yourself to exist without an agenda for 1 minute a day. It's actually really refreshing. Anyway, once you've practiced that a handful of times and you feel comfortable with refocusing your attention on your breath, it's time to take it to the real world. During a conversation with someone, if you notice your attention start to wander, use the same focus technique to gently turn your awareness back to your breath. Once your awareness returns to the present moment, refocus on the person you're listening to. I like to do this by noticing their eye color. It makes for deeper eye contact, and it makes you really zero in on them. This technique brings you back to the present moment, and the person you're talking to is going to immediately sense that they have your full attention. As you practice this, notice how it feels for you, and notice how people react to it. When I started using this technique, people started opening up to me more, and they started seeking me out for conversations. It goes a long ways. The next technique is the strategic pause. The strategic pause is simply a 2-second pause that you employ after someone has finished telling you something important.
That's it?
Yeah, that's really it. It feels weird when you use it because silence can be kind of uncomfortable, but you literally just count to 2 after the other person is done speaking. During the pause, you don't just sit there, but you consider what they said, and you allow your face to react and show emotion as you reflect on what they've told you. Whatever they said, whether you agree with it or not, let it sink in. Let it lead you to better understanding.
You don't have to agree with someone in order to understand them.
With both of these tactical listening techniques, the goal is to make the person feel respected and heard. If you want people to listen to you, it's a two-way street. You have to give in order to get. So if you want people to carefully consider what you have to say, you can take a couple seconds here and there to pause and consider what they have to say. Treat whatever they said as though it's important enough to deserve some time to reflect on it. Allow it to influence your opinion of them and of the topic.
Remember, that's what you're asking of them. Don't ask for anything you're not willing to provide.
Not only are you being a respectful listener, you're also modeling how you expect to be treated when it's your turn.
And the principle of positive reciprocity means they're more likely to give back to you a gift of equal value.
We'd really like to hear how these tips worked for you. Let us know on the Guns Guide to Liberals Facebook page.
In today's bad argument of the day, I want to talk about the unproductive quagmire in which both sides have decided to pitch this battle. We're sinking into the swamp of the language game. Language is not a purely descriptive tool. The words we use actively shape our perception. There's a two-way street, an exchange between how we describe the world and how we see it. Naming something delineates its perceived nature and how we interact with it in many ways. Language is like a map which changes how we engage with the terrain. Language can reveal our priorities, values, biases, and perceptions. It can also anchor or corral us into perceptual frameworks if we're not careful. When it comes to asking the right questions and making the right diagnoses, unbiased language is crucial. Sometimes we don't even really see something until we've named it. And once we've named it, not only is it visible to us, but it becomes a framework for interpreting the world.
The political landscape is full of language games used to frame perception, arguments, and diagnose social issues. The debate about guns is no different.
Gun control activists are simultaneously winning and losing the language game. Insofar as their language sets the terms of the discussion and proliferates widely through politics and culture, they're having huge success. They are using language to frame these issues in a way with which we have difficulty competing. Despite the transparent rebranding, repackaging, and euphemizing, as gun control turns from gun violence, then gun safety, and gun reform, their language sticks and is the default language of this conversation.
It doesn't do much to convince gun rights advocates, as we're aware that the new terminology doesn't indicate a shift in policy. Rather, it's just a new way to frame disagreement as unreasonable.
To us, it's underhanded and unconvincing, but to anyone with a messaging machine, it sells. The problem with this form of the language game is that it illustrates how the map defines our perception of the terrain. While the suffix of control, safety, violence, or reform may change over the years, the framing of the problem with the prefix of gun doesn't.
And to organizations who are concerned with violence and suicide, at least ostensibly concerned, that creates some serious perceptual blinders. By defining it as a gun problem, it assumes that the solution must address guns.
The gun nature of the problem is assumed, not examined, and the erroneous fixation on guns as a granted root cause generates a number of problems. This is an example of how language corrals people into limiting perceptual frameworks. Assuming that, in fact, the true goals are to reduce violence and suicide, the fixation on guns makes those otherwise common goals into a fraught and intractable contest, yielding few results and mostly generating frustration and division. Guns are the path of greatest resistance if the reduction of violence and suicide is actually the goal. The factions occupying both sides of the gun issue have ample common ground on which to tackle those problems otherwise. The second language game failure is that gun control organizations bring in people who want to do something about violence and suicide, proceed to hijack their energy and resources, and then thrust them into this difficult, intractable, and wasteful fight.
Both of us, both pro-gun and anti-gun, could be spending those resources to solve real problems that we agree on, instead of fighting each other.
Another problem with focusing on guns is that it unfairly pits laymen against experts. I'll get into that more later. On the gun rights side, we're failing at the language game on two major fronts. First is that we're decentralized, and we don't have the message unity and discipline that Brady, Moms Demand, or Everytown can buy, refine with focus groups, and disseminate through their infrastructure. Our attempts at the language game are largely reactionary. We see it taking place on the other side, with shifting euphemisms from gun control to gun violence to gun reform, then gun safety, and hijacked terminology like assault weapon and mass shooting being proliferated and misused. When we try and deploy alternative terms like modern sporting rifle, or mass killing, we don't succeed in spreading them outside of our narrow circles of influence, and they instead become purity tests and a form of political correctness which we use against each other. It becomes a doctrinal language among the believers and never transcends into the common parlance.
And our frustration at that results in a kind of language policing which tries to take the place of message discipline, wherein we now get to hate on each other for saying something slightly wrong.
The other way we play the language game is the result of carrying the burden of expertise in this debate. Gun control organizations, by fixating on guns as a root cause, thrust their group members into a debate for which they are unprepared. People who have little to no experience with firearms are thrown into the deep end with people for whom guns play a significant role in their lives. Gun owners who are capable of disassembling their firearms blindfolded are constantly in the position of having to correct and educate people who are advocating for bans and restrictions on technical aspects of equipment they can hardly themselves recognize. Combine this with enough high-profile, cringe-worthy gaffes made by politicians advocating for gun control, and it's hard not to play gotcha with opponents who don't acknowledge that their understanding of the crucial technicalities are on par with Senator Ted Stevens describing the internet as a series of tubes when discussing net neutrality. Correcting these technicalities is important. The technicalities are the nuts and bolts of legislation, and an informed opponent is essential to having an actual debate or discussion. Otherwise, it's just a reluctant education. But we need them to want to know these details.
Without their desire for knowledge, corrections only cause a backfire effect that solidifies their original beliefs. They make people feel like we're using obscure technicalities to freeze them out of a debate they rightfully have a stake in. And in the worst examples, we overtly shame and ridicule people, which builds resentment and makes them more likely to dehumanize us in return.
It's important to set firm boundaries. It's entirely reasonable to refuse to be legislated by those who are less expert than you. That's an indignity and an injustice. When it comes to correcting that and enforcing those boundaries, it helps to remember some fundamentals of persuasion and incentivize them to desire this important information. Their group may have thrown them into the deep end of the pool with us, but we should offer them some floaties instead of holding their heads underwater.
Remember, we don't have to make people fall in love with guns.
We just need to illustrate that gun control doesn't work the way they think it will, and that there are better solutions for reducing violence and suicide on which we can all agree and act together.
That's why this podcast exists. We want to systematically break down the skills of persuasion into concrete, learnable steps and empower you to change the debate.
The strength of the Second Amendment movement has always been our grassroots activism. The front lines of this battle are happening all around us, over dinner tables and over beers in the garage, at book clubs and at yoga classes. Having better conversations isn't just an exercise, it's a powerful form of political activism.
Thanks for listening to Guns Guide to Liberals.
Make sure you follow us on Facebook and join in the conversation. We've got new and interesting content and articles and all sorts of stuff that doesn't make it into the podcast every week.
Yeah, we talk about a lot of different stuff, and it never, these first episodes, we have like kind of a strict lesson plan that we're sticking to because we're trying to break everything down as systematically as possible so that it's easier for people to learn. But we come across a lot of really interesting topics that they don't fit into the plan, but they're still worth discussing, and that's what ends up on our Facebook page.
So join us. Only closers get coffee.
Like, are you saying there's coffee?
It's Minnesota in December. We haven't seen the sun in 36 hours. Of course there's coffee.